In this section, we are going to learn a whole bunch about functions and see some real examples where functions are used in quirky, very JavaScripty ways. We'll do a quick recap of functions which work as first-class citizens in JavaScript. In JavaScript, functions are treated exactly like numbers or strings. If you remember all this well, please feel free to skip over to the later parts of this lecture. How can we treat functions as numbers or strings? You can store functions in a variable. That variable can be used to refer to and invoke that function. You can have a function return a function as a result of its calculations or a result of whatever statements it executes. You can also have a function take in another function as an input argument to itself. So functions behave pretty much like numbers and strings and objects and booleans in JavaScript. These three properties together make functions first-class citizens in JavaScript, and JavaScript behaves a little bit like a functional programming language due to functions being a first-class citizen. Functions in JavaScript, because of these three properties collectively, are called first-class functions. So in summary, remember that functions in JavaScript are first-class functions, which gives JavaScript programming a slightly functional flavor, just like functional programming languages. Now, we'd mentioned that functions in JavaScript can return functions as its return value or take in functions as its input argument. The function which takes in a function as an input argument or returns it as its return value has a specific term. Such functions are called higher order functions. Higher order functions deal with other functions, either as an input argument or as a return value. Spoken earlier about working with more function examples and understanding passing functions as an argument or returning functions as a return type. And we'd asked you to just understand the general idea of first-class functions. The time has come. Now we'll be talking a lot more about how functions work as first-class citizens in JavaScript. Let's tackle our very first example, purely based on functions and its quirks in JavaScript. Functions can be passed as arguments to other functions. Just like we pass in strings, numbers, objects as arguments to functions, other functions can be passed in as arguments as well. This makes things very interesting and allows you to do very useful stuff, such as the algorithm for the implementation can be contained in the function, and that function can be passed in as an argument to another function. Let's see how that works. Let's say we have a rectangle object created via a constructor. This is the rectangle object constructor. We've seen this before. This rectangle has a length, breadth, and color, and a property function getArea which returns length into breadth, the area of this rectangle. With the rectangle object constructor, we can create a whole bunch of rectangle objects. Now let's say we need to be able to compare rectangle objects. We need to be able to compare two rectangles together. And when we say compare, we mean operations such as greater than, less than, or equal to. We want to be able to say whether one rectangle is greater than another, one rectangle is less than another, or a rectangle is equal to another. How would we do this? Notice the signs greater than, less than, and equal to represented by the double equal to sign. When you're comparing one object with another, you use the double equal to sign in JavaScript. So how do we do this? The very first question you ought to ask is, how does one compare two rectangles? What does it mean for one rectangle to be greater than, less than, or equal to another? There are three possibilities. You could compare two rectangles by their lengths. You could say if the length of one rectangle is greater than the length of the second rectangle, the first rectangle is greater than the second. Or you could say I want to compare rectangles using their breadth. If the breadth of one rectangle is smaller than the breadth of another, then the first rectangle is smaller than the other. Or you could say I want to compare by area. Areas of two rectangles are equal, the rectangles are equal. This choice is yours. As a developer, you could choose how you want to compare the rectangles. How would you write something which allows you to specify how you want to compare the rectangles? At runtime, when you execute your code, you want to be able to specify compare by length or breadth or area. It's easy in JavaScript. You just pass in a function which does the comparison that you want by length, breadth, or area. You have a function which compares two rectangles. How it compares those two rectangles can be specified in a separate function which you pass in to the compare function. That's right. By passing in a function as an argument to your general purpose compare function, you can say what you want to compare the rectangles by. So you'll have compare two rectangles. This is the function you're going to work with. Along with the two rectangles you want to compare, you could also pass into this function a function called compare function. And that compare function would compare rectangle 1 and rectangle 2 and return the right result. Notice the compare function that we've passed in as an argument to compare two rectangles function. The result of this compare function is what this compare two rectangle returns. This compare function can be anything. You can choose to compare the two rectangles on whatever basis you feel like. If you want to compare the two rectangles by length, modify your compare function and pass in the correct version which will compare them by length. If you want to compare them by breadth, no problem, just change the compare function. Or if you want to compare two rectangles based on their areas, once again, change the compare function that you pass in as an argument to this compare two rectangles function. Just pass in the correct version of the compare function to get the comparison that you want. A quick word about this compare function and what it does and the values that it returns. A compare function in programming languages typically is a function which compares two objects, two numbers, two strings, anything. In our compare function will take in two rectangles. It will return a number greater than 0 if the first rectangle, rectangle 1, is greater than rectangle 2, whether it's greater on the basis of its length, breadth, or area. It will return a number equal to 0 if rectangle 1 is equal to rectangle 2. Again, the equal to can be basis of its length, breadth, or area. The compare function will return a number less than 0 if rectangle 1 is less than rectangle 2. This is the standard format of a compare function in any programming language. This is just an aside for you to know how the compare function works so that the rest of the code makes much more sense. Let's go back to comparing our two rectangles. We are going to pass in a function that does the actual comparison, and we are going to pass in a function which compares two rectangles by area. So we'll call compare two rectangles, that's the basic higher order function, and pass in our comparison function. Our comparison function is called compare two rectangles by area, and the implementation of this function will actually compare the two rectangles on the basis of its area. Let's see what the implementation looks like. Here is the implementations of the compare two rectangles by area function. It takes in two rectangles, rectangle 1 and rectangle 2. It calculates the area using the get area function or the property function on the rectangle, and then returns area 1 minus area 2, returns the sign of area 1 minus area 2. Remember, we've spoken about what the compare function returns. Math.sign returns -1 for a negative number, +1 for a positive number, and 0 if the numbers are equal. So area 1 minus area 2, if area 1 is larger than area 2, math.sign will return +1. If area 1 is smaller than area 2, math.sign will return -1. And if they are exactly equal, it will return 0. Exactly like how we want the compare function to behave. This function compares two rectangles by area. The compare function to compare two rectangles by length and breadth would be very similar to this. In fact, it would be much simpler since length and breadth are direct properties of the rectangle object. Let's say you wanted to compare two rectangles by length. You'll simply pass in the compare two rectangles by length function to the compare two rectangles function. This is in addition to rectangle 1 and rectangle 2. If you look at the implementation of compare two rectangles by length, you'll notice that it returns math.sign of rectangle 1.length minus rectangle 2.length. Which means if the first rectangle's length is greater than the second rectangle, we'll return 1. If the first rectangle's length is smaller than the second rectangle, we'll return -1. If the lengths are exactly equal, we'll return 0. Notice we can simply change the compare function that we pass in to perform the correct comparison that we are interested in.